after my appearance on the Daily Ketchup, I have been stopped on the streets, like by people, like just randomly. Hey, you appeared on Daily Ketchup. That has never happened before with my podcast, like my 100 plus episodes.
I think a lot of us do maybe take the only accountability part as maybe comments calling you out or POFMA, and I don't think that should be it.
I'm not sure we have done a terribly good job actually, especially I think for the majority, right, of actually having the majority appreciate what life in Singapore is actually like for non-majority Singaporeans.
Podcasts especially are critical sources of us to really meet the personality as well. So it's like an online MPS, the meet the personality session.
As we get bigger and become more influential, so to speak, there's going to be outside factors, maybe let's say money, for example, coming to us. And then how do we then continue to stay independent in face of wealth?
I don't want to assume that we'll all still be relevant 5 years from now. And I don't want to take that for granted. I think it's quite important for us to all work hard to remain relevant in our own ways, whatever our own flavors are.
The thing that I hope not to see is basically that we all create mini echo chambers for ourselves. I think that's my greatest worry. Because if Singapore were only 5 million, right, if everyone is a small echo chamber, then we don't hear each other.
Great, they are great for views, they're great for entertainment, but do they contribute to the growth of society as a maturing democracy? I don't think so.
We talked about more sensitive topics like polygamy, divorce, inheritance, and somehow the content went to Facebook and the backlash was so strong.
We don't need consensus per se in Singapore. The question is, can we talk and have that conversation, even if at the end of the day, you all shake hands and shake heads and say, I still don't agree, but okay.
I think we need to be guided by our patriotism for this country that we love. Hello, welcome to... Don't I sound like a rock star? Okay, welcome to IQ, Inconvenient Questions. And today's edition, looking at all the celebrities, is Podcasters Roundtable. Okay, the table isn't exactly round. Yeah. Why are we here today? We are here because the podcasters this time round, general election, played a very significant role. Not a critical role, but a significant role in the outcome of the election. But more than the outcome of the election, I think in setting the tone for conversations, especially during the hustings of the election. Now, we'd like to talk a little bit more about how this role can be further enhanced to give greater meaning to the kind of discussions we want to engender leading up to polling day. Right? That's the reason why we're here. Okay. Now, let's have a very casual, open, honest conversation, stopping short of libel. And I'm looking at certain individuals when I say that. Okay. Before I say anything nonsensical further, I'd like to hand over to my deputy editor of Inconvenient Questions, Yanung.
All right, thank you, Vishwa. And I think firstly, thanks everyone for coming to join us today. I'm really just thankful to be in the midst of people who have shaped how we have talked about the elections, other current affairs in the past couple of years. We'll do some quick introductions for our viewers. So we start off with Darren. So Darren Mark, one of the co-hosts of the Plan B podcast. You guys cover issues in both a written commentary format as well as through your thought-provoking podcast. So Darren, could you share with us why Plan B?
Okay, so I am going to have a very boring but truthful answer, which is that I didn't come up with a name. And honestly, it was one sentence. I didn't come up with a name.
Okay.
I think we'll allow.
Yeah, one more sentence.
One more sentence.
Okay. We are not the contraception. We did not. It did not occur to us. I've been asked this many times before. Oh, you mean that Plan B? Nope.
Okay, great. Thank you, Darren. And next to Darren, we have Daniel Lim, one of the hosts of the Daily Ketchup. You guys cover everything, right, from relationships to politics. I think yesterday you guys released the best hawker food around Singapore. So yeah, so that's amazing. I mean, like, really caters to a wide variety of audiences. So Daniel, why Daily Ketchup and not something else?
And ketchup is spelled Ketchup.
That's right.
Ketchup.
That's right. Again, I did not come. No, actually, I contributed to the name. Thanks for having me. Actually, the name is the Daily Ketchup because it actually was a daily show. During COVID, during Circuit Breaker, I was alone in my bedroom hosting a recap show as though for someone to catch up on the news. And then we eventually turned it into a podcast the year after.
But why Ketchup?
Because we felt when we looked at the word ketchup, like CATCHUP, it just didn't look right for some reason. And then when we spelled it as ketchup, it just looked right. There was no better explanation than that. So sorry to disappoint you. And I also like ketchup. So
That's a good reason. Yes.
I should have led with that.
Great, thank you, Daniel. And we have Associate Professor Walid from NTU School of Social Sciences. Beyond the classroom, people know you as a host of Teh Tarik with Walid. Why Teh Tarik? Why not kopi?
So Teh Tarik is my favorite drink, so I start with that, and I drink it every day. But also, I think it's quintessentially Singaporean, and also the name. I think it's very informal, and it disarms the guests, the politicians when it's informal.
And certainly, I think from the conversations, it is very disarming, authentic, humorous. So great, thank you.
So you do see a need to disarm politicians?
Of course. That I think that is actually, before we get into the serious stuff, that is the difference between mainstream media and podcast. We have the advantage of disarming the politicians and shrouding our tough questions in humor.
You sound sinister. I like it. I love it. Okay.
Right, next we have Raj Kumar. You are involved in youth dialogues, conversations, interfaith. And last year, you actually had a chance to meet Pope Francis when he was in Singapore. Right? So, Pope Raj, you don't have a podcast, but what is one thing you want to say to our viewers today about yourself? Tell us one thing.
I think the beauty of podcasts and all of us coming together is that through our sharing of our diverse perspectives, we really help each other make meaning of how different phenomena are happening within Singapore and what is our role within in it. So I think for me, even though I don't have a podcast, but I probably will by the end of our session today, I think what I've sought to do personally is to really foster conversations outside. And perhaps those are the unpublicized podcasts that we work on.
Right, as you say, sometimes the podcast, but without the name, right? Excellent. Thank you, Raj. Next to Raj, we have Joel Lim, host of the Political Prude. You burst onto the scene GE2025 with your coverage. And what I like is that you actually make the concepts and policies very simple, caters to a younger audience, a more social media, tech-savvy audience. So Joel, tell us a bit about why Political Prude?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me here. And I think that this is such a cool panel. I watch all of you on YouTube and Spotify. And then I follow you guys on Instagram. And I watch your speeches in Parliament as well. So I'm like, this is like such a cool panel. But yeah, for Political Prude, I think it happened, I think GE2020 was when I think everybody was at home and I was talking about the elections back then. And what happened was, while I was discussing politics, a lot of first-time voters then said, can you just tell me who to vote for? And I was like, okay, absolutely not. But what I can do is that maybe, with a little bit of a platform now, let's like ask people who know what they're talking about to teach us. So the very first person I had on an Instagram live stream show was Professor Walid here. And we, we went IG live and we, talked about politics. He was teaching me politics, and along with us, a few thousand people were listening in live as well. And the Straits Times, I guess, caught notice and they asked me, what is the name of your live stream show? And back then, I was hosting a dating podcast. It was called The Naughty Prude, which is an oxymoron. And I thought like a lot of Singaporeans are quite naughty, but actually we're also very prudish outwardly. So I thought it was a very cute name. And on the spot, I was like, okay, Political Prude. So that's how the name came about. Nothing cool, not a really cool story behind it, but that's alliteration. So I think it's cool. Yeah. Cool. Thanks for having me.
So you don't sound like a prude.
Well, that's to be decided.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Joel, for joining us. On my left, we have Kian Boon Ng, relatively new podcaster. You were a commodities trader before you went into podcasting. You started out Red Dot Perspective.
Okay, I'll keep it to one sentence. So, Red Dot Perspective, right? So, I wanted to be complementary to the mainstream media. So, I wanted to offer alternative perspective on Singapore things. And that includes politics, current affairs, and news.
I have a question. Do you comb your hair?
So how my hair looks like on my podcast, right, totally depends on how I wake up. And recently, it hasn't been kind to me in the morning. It's rough.
So do you just wake up?
It's best not to discuss this.
Okay.
Yeah. It's a subject of a lot of questions every day. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Thanks so much, Kian Boon. Next, we have Juliana Frederica, founder of Lepak Conversations. You guys do a lot of ground-up conversations on issues that are important around race, identity, policy as well. Share with our viewers and all of us, what is the genesis behind the name Lepak Conversations?
Right, I think it's quite straightforward. So what we do is we have lepak conversations, right? Lepak meaning chill, accessible. But there is a dual meaning actually. So a lot of people tell me our conversations not actually very lepak lah, and it's intentional. So there's a certain negative connotation to lepak, which means you can also be lazy.
Sure.
So what we do is actually to debunk myths, stereotypes about the Malay Muslim community specifically.
And you can talk about serious issues in a relaxed and chill manner, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Great. Thanks, Juliana. Next, we have Associate Professor Walter Cesera from SUSS School of Business. Prof, you are a trained economist and you have contributed, I think, to our political scene for a couple of years, policy, mobility, and also a former NMP. Prof, what is one thing you want to share with our viewers today?
One sentence.
It's going to be a very long sentence, but okay. All right. So I think the only power actually that an MP has, a backbencher, right, is the power to communicate with the voters and maybe explain something about a policy idea or concept they have and convince people maybe to support it. So I think everybody here actually performs a very important role because you're the only way nowadays that these guys can actually, men and women can actually connect with the public, not just through parliament, right, but also through your podcast and other content.
Great, thank you, Prof. Last but not least, we have Keith Yap, a former civil servant. Now you are host of the Front Row podcast. You have interesting conversations from artists to civil servants to political leaders, corporate leaders. Tell us what made you start the podcast and name it The Front Row.
I was thinking that the world is changing rapidly now. We're entering into what we call an ambiguous world. And I think I wanted to put myself and the audience in the front row seat, just as you would maybe in a classroom. So I thought, since I'm a nerd, I love being at the front of the class. Why not call it the Front Row Podcast?
Great.
Keith, when did you see the light?
Until now, I haven't found the light yet. Hopefully today.
But you left the civil service.
Yes.
Okay.
We leave it as that. All right, and thanks everyone for the introductions. And of course, a shout out as well to our good friends from Yalabat. So they would love to be here today, Harsh and Terence, but unfortunately they can't make it due to some last minute matters. So before we pass the time over to Vishwa, IQ, inconvenient questions, one sentence. Basically, we believe in having inconvenient conversations, and more than that, to be comfortable with having these inconvenient conversations as a society, because the fact is that there's so many things out there. How can we be more comfortable talking about the uncomfortable things? So that's us, IQ.
Well, to add on to what Ian said, see, we tend to confuse the term being safe, with avoiding anything that will make it discomforting for us. There's a big difference. What we should aspire to is, how do we create a safe space for us to talk about things that make us uncomfortable? Because if we always steer clear of things that make us uncomfortable, we will be a society that is hypocritical. And that's what we want to avoid going forward. You guys talked about when you started getting involved in election coverage. I think with the exception of maybe one or two, everybody else, right, was involved this time in podcasts. Any guesses when I got involved in election coverage? Mistake me not for my beard, but any guesses?
1984?
1984, I was in SBC, Singapore Broadcasting Corporation, and I was a young current affairs producer, and I was sent to Sembawang, as Chee Soon Juan was, and I was there, and it was a historic moment for two reasons. One, that was the first time when J.B. Jeyaretnam won in the general election. Because he became an MP in a by-election for ensign in 1981. But 84 was when he was in a general election. Who was the other person? The other opposition member who got elected in 1984? Shamsi Tong. These are the two big giants they got. So that was a very important year, right? The other thing to understand is, this is slightly funny, ironic perhaps. Tony Tan, first time running for Sembawang, right? Sembawang. There was no GRC then, obviously. His opponent was a Sembawang shipyard skilled worker called Stanley Mariadas. I'll never forget the name. He was an independent candidate. He didn't put up a single poster. He didn't campaign. He worked, from what I understand, he worked on polling day. And he got 28% of the votes. Now that was a very important statement that Singaporeans, at least the Singaporeans in Sembawang, made. Because you're not talking about a rookie here. You're talking about Dr. Tony Tan. So that was the first significant introduction I had about election coverage. A lot has happened since then, right? A lot has happened. Today we have so many different ways to acquire knowledge. But what is important is for us to ask ourselves, what was our contribution, significant contribution, or experience or learning point this time round? Keith, you want to go first?
So I think actually in this election I didn't actually cover any GE stuff because I thought it would be interesting to watch the space play out. So what I did was I continued producing what I did. But something I've been trying to focus on that would tie into the GE was that we needed to understand the macro environment around us. I think before the GE, a lot of us kind of heard of the Trump tariffs, but a lot of us didn't actually know what that meant, how that meant for us as Singaporeans. So I thought that was the contribution I hoped to make beyond just the GE, but 5 years on, 10 years on, which is let's make sense of the global context and then how we as Singaporeans can make sense and respond to it.
So not just during the GE hustings, but in between GEs. Right. Thanks. Anyone else? Daniel.
For us at the Daily Ketchup, our coverage was for 6 out of the 9 campaigning days, we did a live stream every night. 6 because weekends and public holiday we didn't want to work. But reason why we wanted to do it live was because we wanted to, for one, be able to give the audience an unedited, unfiltered version of our interviews. But the second was to be able to have this live feedback from live chat as to, for us to almost shape the episode in real time. And what was very interesting for us is that it was a stark reminder of just how different the levels of interest when it comes to politics is with our audience, but also the electorate. Whenever we tend to start off with slightly easy personal questions first, we saw chat basically saying, okay, let's get to policy. Let's not waste any more time. And so overcompensate, it's live, we're seeing that, we pivot, and then when we get to pretty serious conversation, another group will come on and say, wait a minute, I thought you guys were more casual, a little bit more chill. What's going on here? And so for us to be able to figure out that balance was quite key for us. And I think, some nights we maybe got the balance a bit off, some nights we got it right, but that was something for us to take away. Yeah.
What was your most interesting interview?
I think there were 2 in particular. The first was with, so we actually interviewed candidates from about 7 or 8 different parties. And we were very proud of that because I think we were able to really get a sense of all the different parties and what they stood for and just publish it as is because it was live. When we spoke to SDA's Desmond Lim, I thought it was particularly interesting because he often gets covered and he's usually the butt of the joke. It's usually memes. And for him to be able to explain very clearly to us why he does what he does, why has he been doing this for decades, and for the chat to even explode almost of people coming in and talking about how he's a pillar of the community and all the work that he's done for charity. That was particularly insightful for us. And the second, but just on a more personal level, was our interview with Lim Tian. Because I think oftentimes with, I guess his reputation or maybe media's portrayal, there is a perception of him being maybe a bit unfiltered or unhinged, a word that I used in front of
Or
his face.
belligerent.
Yeah, perhaps. And to actually interview him in a space where he had time to breathe, I found him actually quite thoughtful. And I think that was a perception that I wasn't prepared to have. And I found myself actually I picked up a bad habit from that interview. So he actually answered a lot of questions with, all I'll say is this. And I thought it was very clever because you get to navigate the question however you like. You get to dodge any follow-ups. And in casual conversation for 2 weeks after that, I found myself using that. So I apologize if I start any response by saying, all I'll say is this.
Very, very well put.
Actually, for me, I think that's an interesting point because we kind of had a multi-party forum. We invited folks, including Lim Tian, and so he was late. I mean, he came from the party broadcast in MediaCorp, and he was so apologetic about it. He was like, "I'm so sorry, I'm late. I'm trying to get a cab. It's tough." So I think to see and to hear the human side of him behind the personas, that for me was also very refreshing. So I think just wanted to add on to that point.
Actually, this point about demystifying people, because we caricature, right? We in any society, they're caricatures. In certain societies, like ours included, those caricatures are fed constantly, and they can cause tremendous harm to individuals, as well as it can be highly inaccurate in informing the public about these individuals. Who else has had an experience like that, where your own stereotypes about the individual was forced to be broken or challenged?
Actually, I'm a bit mixed on this. So on one hand, I do think what Daniel said about demystifying somebody like Desmond Lim, I think that provides an invaluable service. By the way, I think Daily Ketchup did wonderful throughout the election season. I think they did absolute great service to Singaporeans. On the other, I also always worry, am I portraying this personal side of this politician, which honestly it wouldn't matter to Singaporeans. Who ultimately, does it really matter if this person is a good father or good brother, good sister? Like, it shouldn't matter to us. So the danger for me is when we do podcasts, and I'm reflecting on the way even my interviews, when we humanize them too much, right? On one hand, we want to humanize them. We want to humanize people who have been dehumanized, right? People like Lim Tian or even Chee Soon Juan for the longest time. On the other, do I really need to know too much about you? And what is the line between personality and policy and ideology? That is something that always lingers in my mind.
It's a great point you raised. To clarify, I'm not suggesting that we need to humanize. That's a very proactive position. But it is to challenge current assumptions, which may or may not include humanization. But if we don't go in with a view to question, challenge current perceptions of the individual, whether it's right or wrong, but what we want to avoid is to draw conclusions for the public. Stopping short of that, that's important. Darren?
Yeah, so I guess now I'm going to challenge something that Walid just said. And of course, I agree with you that as a matter of should, on a personal level, of course, I think you should be more concerned about ideas and policy rather than the person. But I think one observation that I also made throughout the whole GE period was that ultimately people are entitled to vote the way they want to based on whatever they want. I mean, that's the content of the right to vote. Yeah, I get it. So because you said just now, right? Like, but you should think about the policy behind it. You should think.
I was talking about the podcasters. Sorry, I was talking about the podcasters' role. Of course, I mean, people are entitled to vote the way they vote. I mean, that's a given, right? But the podcasters' duty, in terms of what we choose to put out there, and what is the line between balancing the personal and the political.
Exactly. So you cannot just have a fully policy-driven episode, for example, because then that's potentially going to become very boring and dry. And like you said, right, some people don't want that. And on the other hand, if you have something that's entirely too personal, then you risk basically kind of dumbing down the whole process and kind of making a mockery of.
But why dichotomize it? Why draw a dichotomy when actually we are all a combination of both? Isn't it? I mean, I feel that our job is to bring out how the two get combined.
I think
You know?
I think this was a point that I also wanted to allude to as well. At the end of the day, I think podcasts especially are critical sources of us to really meet the personality as well. So it's like an online MPS, the meet the personality session, where you not only get to understand like what are some of these points or policies that you want to advocate for, but I think more importantly, you really want to get to understand the individual and the thought process that they come behind supporting certain policies. And I think that's a very important element of us as voters as well. How do we make our decision about the particular individual and the policies that they are pushing for, and what is the slant that they are coming with?
Joel, you are reacting to what you're saying. What's going through your mind?
Yeah. I mean, for one, I think that, you know, life experiences, whether it's personal life or professional life, like they will impact the way you think or the way you view the world. And that's what I think I want to know about a person as well, with regards to where they stand on certain issues or what their policies are. So when it comes to maybe like humanizing certain people, I think I want to see it from the perspective of how that impacts how they would maybe perform as leaders and how they would speak up on certain issues, for example. And I think, while I was also listening to everyone here, to just go back to the first question, right, which is like, what was your contribution this election? I think when I reflect upon my contribution this time around, I think I was quite like intentional in that I already knew that entering the GE space, there's going to be so many more podcasts today and so many different types of content today. And I guess because of the kind of content that I do, the kind of people who follow as well, they don't really always follow because it's like very intelligent, or, you know, they sometimes just want things to be broken down for them. And a lot of them see the headlines, they don't always follow and don't always understand. And when it comes to things like what is a minister and what is an MP, a lot of Singaporeans still don't understand the difference between the two. And when I tell you know, people who are obviously following politics and covering politics, they're like, that's impossible. There's no way, right? But then you ask, you know, peers, and they're like, yeah, this person minister, but actually they're not, right? So I thought, well, you know, there are some people who can do content, that kind of content, a lot better than I can. And I thought, what is the audience that I'm trying to serve this time around? And it was people who maybe don't follow politics or don't understand politics. And that's why I spent a lot of time, you know, doing like a crash course on how to understand politics, or how to even navigate the elections, right? How do you think about your vote? How do you understand how parliament works, for example? I always say, you know, in a way, we're kind of giving someone a job, right? Because as you think of yourself as like a HR person, right? Like if you want to give someone a job, you kind of need to know what the job entails in the first place and what makes them qualified to do the job. So if you're giving someone a job, we shouldn't be voting based on vibes, which is what a lot of people say that is vote based on.
You know, it's very interesting what you just said, right? There are two things. One is you could give a crash course, right? And or you could provide insights. One is information, the other is insights, right? If it's pure information, it can be fairly boring. Insights are important to give people the aha moment. I never saw it that way. But it's not necessarily undergirded by facts per se, but it's experience, right? So one of my experiences in putting out a commentary was where I emphasized that in a Westminster system of parliament, you're not electing an office bearer. You are electing a member of parliament from which office bearers are selected. So when you're going to the poll, you know, just be clear in your mind that you're not selecting people to be in government. You are identifying someone who would be a good member of parliament for you in your constituency, and that's the whole Westminster system. It's for the party in power to then decide on who they want to select to be Prime Minister and so on. And it was very interesting because that was more insight than fact per se, right? It's to give them a sense of where it should be. Now, there were individuals who felt that I overstepped the bounds because that was not my job. There were people, there were civil servants, there were some members of the political elite who had very gently reminded me that my job, was not to go and provide these insights. I gently told them, there is a door somewhere here. You may find it yourself. I'm not going to help you. But you see, at the end of the day, we decide as podcasters, we decide on how we want to convey it. As long as it's responsible, as long as it's reasonably accurate and sound. But there has to be that latitude. I completely agree with you. We have to choose the role that we want to play as a podcaster. As long as it's legitimate, it does not misdirect, in my view. Now, Mr. Analysis.
Okay, representing the left side of the room. Actually, as the conversation went along, right, I kind of realized that many of you actually do interviews, and you get so much insights from the people that you interview, right? And my personal opinion is that interviews are by nature partisan as a starting point. And then good interviewers are then able to extract the other side of the story and find something interesting about the people they're interviewing, right? So I think there is a growing appetite and almost like a two-track where podcasters can go. One is the interview track where you get personal with the person. The other track is the analytics part, right? Like Vishwa was alluding to. So it's almost as though, back in the days, right? Finance used to be just plus minus divide times, right? Simple, shouting numbers at a pit, right? But as the physicists came into the scene, right, they actually quantified finance and it became the way it is today. So it's almost as though, right, politics can go through that sort of journey also, where we put in numbers to back up some of the things that we're seeing so that people can look at it and say, this is an interesting perspective from another point of view by looking at the numbers.
Could you give an example of that?
So, for example, one of the things that people often talk about are what is the impact of boundary changes. Of course, the term they use is a gerrymandering, right? So let's pick a place. For example, West Coast, right? The former West Coast today is the West Coast Jurong West GRC. Out of 200,000 over voters, about 40,000 of them will move from the former Jurong GRC to West Coast GRC. So, and many people know that Jurong used to be a PAP stronghold under President Taman. So, 70% of people vote for PAP. So, what is the impact of that? Because that would then set the starting point for that GRC from the get-go. And then people can think about, okay, I interview Mr. Leong Man Wai, I get his views on his manifesto. I talk to Mr. Desmond Lee and talk about his housing plans. Then I can game it in my head and put all of it together and say that, as a voter, I see how I would want to vote. So it's almost as though there are roles that we play as podcasters, right? The interview side and then there's the analytics side.
How do you see us combining the two? Because it's almost as if, it's age-old left brain, right brain dichotomy. But today, I think we need to find ways to interface the two. Walter, you are the other, supposed to be an analyst.
Yeah, I don't think I have a direct answer to that question about maybe how podcasts should bridge this gap, right? Or this role between, I think, telling the story that the politicians, of the politicians, who they are, what they want to do, and so on, versus trying to provide more analysis. I think when I thought about the role that all of you guys here and ladies are playing, I thought one thing that was interesting was that unlike the mainstream traditional media in Singapore, one thing you have going for you is authenticity, right? Or at least I think that's something that many of you try to actually sell as a principle or as a central selling point, right? Because you're presumably not beholden to the authorities. You may or may not be running this for profit, or maybe it's just for personal interest. But basically, I think one of the reasons why the electorate and your audience listens to you is that they think that you're offering them a more authentic view of what's really going on, your own perspective. It may be biased in a certain way, but at least presumably there are no or fewer ulterior motives. But then I also wonder whether that's an illusion, right? And the reason why I wonder whether that's an illusion is that I think for Singaporeans, I don't think there are that many Singaporeans out there who tune into MediaCorp or read the Straits Times without having a sense that there might be a particular angle or slant to the news, right? I mean, most Singaporeans are aware of the amount of government funding and so on in the mainstream media, so that's obvious. But do they have the same, perhaps, enlightened skepticism when they tune into podcasts? Are they aware, for example, that some podcasts might be subject to the same amount perhaps of editing and slanting and, favoring a particular candidates or whatever that the mainstream media may or may not actually engage in, right? So that's something I often think about. So I guess what I'm saying is there's a very powerful tool that podcasts have in terms of being more authentic and therefore being able to reach the audience or the electorate, and then they lower their guard a little bit, right? Because they think, okay, there's no angle here, unlike maybe so-called mainstream media. But I'm not sure that's the case for all podcasts all the time.
Yeah.
And I have also noticed that mainstream media, in doing their own podcasts and so on, also are trying to ride on that as well, of course, right? With varying degrees of success.
So let me ask you this, right? When you look at larger economies or larger jurisdictions, USA, India, democracies, India, UK, Germany, it's not uncommon, it's not unusual for you to have different media organizations taking positions. Should we not think along those lines that we could at some point even move in that direction? Say 2030, 2035, where there are maybe 30 podcast groups. It's not impossible. And when you have such critical mass, it may not be unhealthy for different groups to take sides. And no one is claiming neutrality. See, neutrality is not necessarily good by itself. It's actually agnostic, right? So there's conviction that you can communicate, which sometimes is lost when you want to be too neutral, right? So this is something for us to think about. What are your views, Keith?
I want to resonate with what Prof shared just now. I think what makes people tune into your podcast, I think, is really your editorial taste.
Yeah.
They like you for the way you think about things. And with that, you build trust. So I think this is a premium that you have that I think necessarily mainstream media might not have. Because you've produced at a clip that's regular. I think for the Daily Ketchup folks, if I watch Daily Ketchup every week religiously, when the politics season comes, I'm going to put a premium on them over, for example, say Straits Times.
Right.
So I think we need to really think sincerely about the trust that our audience puts on us. And then that should shape the way we continue proceeding with podcasts. With regard to the point of, maybe the fragmentation of the media market, so we have 30 podcasts, my only concern is that you could create polarization in such a diverse society. And I think that one of the spaces that I really like as a podcaster and just as a consumer and as a producer is that it allows you to enjoy diversity. You can speak to different political parties, but at the end of the day, you recognize that everyone's a Singaporean here. And that's something we can never lose sight of. If you're too convicted in your own stance, then that necessarily, to me, leads to polarization. And I don't know whether that's a good thing for a society as small, as diverse as Singapore.
Yeah.
You spoke about diversity, polarization, and I think that's where I can offer my perspective. So I have been a podcast guest, right? I'm not a podcast host. And what stood out to me first is the intergenerational aspect. So my first podcast was on inconvenient questions. It was an intergenerational one. And that led to a second one, a Malay podcast called Wicara. And I think that was more impactful for me, specifically because I think I'm very aware that there are very strong echo chambers within the Malay Muslim community. And it's very obvious in the work because, for example, and there's a reason why we stay on Instagram, right? Because it's a younger audience, they have a certain political leaning. It's that's exactly the audience that we want to work with. But there was an instant where I think we spoke about Muslim women's issues. So we talked about more sensitive topics like polygamy, divorce, inheritance, and somehow the content went to Facebook, aka an older demographic. And the backlash was so strong. It was as bad as there were personal attacks, like questioning us. So I'm very much aware of this polarization within the community, which is why I thought what was interesting and necessary, I think, moving forward is more of these intergenerational conversations that are recorded for people to see, and hopefully that translates to more of these conversations happening offline as well.
Yeah. Ian, you feel strongly about intergenerational conversations.
Having had a chance to speak with so many people, young and old, during this whole season.
As you can tell, he's much younger than I am.
Especially with Vishwa.
Actually, you can't tell. Yeah.
Thanks for the compliment.
Yeah.
I mean, I do feel that I think we tend to have definitely we have our own niche audience, right? Let's say, for example, on certain platforms, you cater to a younger audience. But I think the fact is that definitely there's a lot that we can learn from our seniors and vice versa. I think, for example, without history, how do we appreciate why certain politicians say the things that they do today? For me, as a younger person, appreciating history a lot more and knowing how that shapes the way we see things. And therefore, for me, it's also to be less judgmental in how we actually approach certain people or certain points of view.
Speaking precisely to the strength of podcasts, it is because podcasts are able to bring individuals of different perspectives and backgrounds that allow you to be able to hold that conversation and in a way channel some of the inner thoughts that many of the audience members have, so much so that you are then able to kind of show that thought process happening right as the conversation is happening. And I think that itself becomes a very strong tool of, again, being able to bring and galvanize communities together in a way that ought to create friendships or create unity amongst the audience as well. So I mean, even as podcasts may tend to have a particular audience of their own, more importantly, the responsibility of a podcaster, I feel, is also someone who's able to lightly challenge some of the perspectives of their audience members while being able to bring in and hold space even for discomfort, even for the kind of conversations that may not go. And I think where I can also add to this perspective is that even in our work with the IRO Youth Wing, where we hold conversations, where we hold catch-up sessions, where we allow for conversations to come in around these areas, it is precisely because we allow a safe space and we honor that safe space and perspectives amongst our youths that gives them the courage to be able to voice their perspectives. And we've created a lot of opportunities for intergenerational learning as well, when they are able to see that they can have an answer, and sometimes we may not even come to have a collective answer as well, right? Just being able to hold that discomfort, that longing that, okay, at the end of the day, I want to be able to think a bit deeper, or I want to be able to engage issues from a different perspective. I think that is a very strong key and skill that we need to continue nurturing, even from our podcast, even with a diverse range of audiences coming in.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah. So one thing that I want to go back to a little bit is like the idea of the polarization of endorsing, for example. Yeah. So I think it's already happening. Like not all, of course, but some content creators actually are quite unabashed about it. We had an interview with Wake Up Singapore. This was not this was before he announced his running, his candidature. But he talked about how, like his page, his own. I mean, he's not a podcaster, but he creates content, right? He said it. They are pro-opposition, not necessarily partisan, like a particular party, but they do promote oppositional politics in that sense. And he was unabashed about it. And so, to me, the question is not whether it should or should not happen, because it's already happening. You can't stop it. You don't have legal mechanisms, for example, to prevent this kind of behavior or endorsements. And it's gonna happen because it's already happened. The question is, we are all content producers to some level here. Do we want to do that? Because I know that you said neutrality is not necessarily a good thing, but I mean, I kind of differ a little because I think it is. But that's my own personal preference. I know other content creators.
What's the difference, Darren, between neutrality and balance?
Well, I am neutral in the sense that I don't endorse. Okay. Yeah.
Balance?
I think balance is what, regardless of what your own stance is, to present from as many positions as you can. So, for example, you were saying just now that you've gotten a variety of parties onto your table, and I think that's what we wanted to do. Unfortunately, we didn't get a response from some people, so we couldn't. But that's what we wanted to do, even though I personally am neutral. But we seek to have that balance. And I know some of my other co-hosts, for example, they have their own views, different from mine. But regardless of that, as an outfit, we strive to have that balance, to make sure that everything at least is covered and presented.
Can I?
Yes, Walid.
So maybe just to agree with Darren and maybe disagree with Keith slightly about the part about conviction. I hope a lot of people have conviction. It cannot be that conviction leads to less neutrality or something. I think that's not what we should be looking for. And one of the things that the term balance is also used in Singapore a lot of times, it's to be pro-establishment, which I think we should reject also. What does
the
balance
way it
mean?
is seen, the
Yeah,
word balance.
the moment you're slightly critical, then you are no longer balanced, right? So I think we must also be a bit careful of those terms. But I do agree with Darren's principle about being balanced, regardless of your personal stances, because all of us will have personal stances. It's just we are pretending if we say we do not, whether we give exposure to the other sides. So for instance, there are some issues which I have a lot of conviction on Palestine. Right? And I'm absolutely convinced about it. But for me, the balance comes in where maybe I get people who disagree with me and then we have a chat.
Would you proactively engage people with a different point of view?
Absolutely.
To challenge your own
Absolutely.
first assumptions.
I remember during the national debate on Chinese privilege, for instance, I had people on who disagreed with me, people who actually disagreed with me in public. So I would, that's the way I think we strive for balance. But in the process, I don't think we should lose our conviction.
May I just quickly
rebut.
stand correct? I think I like to clarify what I mean. I think we need strong convictions but lightly held. Meaning that I think we should have a sense of intellectual humility to accept that where we could change our minds. So my worry is that you become so convicted that you're held present to your views, which I think what Prof Walid did is exactly what he did is actually a demonstration of what we should avoid, what we should uphold ourselves towards, which is to be intellectually curious and flexible.
My only correction there, perhaps humbly, is it need not just be intellectual.
Yeah.
The problem is we tend to look at things intellectually. Quite often, the issue could be emotional, and we should not be bashful about dealing with emotional dissonance, which we are more uncomfortable with emotional dissonance. So I'm just qualifying that it's not just intellectual. The problem can arise when people take very hard-line emotional positions. Where you don't feel there's a need to explain intelligently, my emotions justify themselves. Once we start taking those positions, it's hard. Daniel?
I was going to say that I think this entire topic was a huge learning point for us, because I think in terms of being neutral, being fair, and being balanced, these were three words that we ended up realizing were actually very different. And what we actually ended up doing was realizing that it would be very inauthentic for any of us to not represent or for us to mask any form of political leanings. But what would be a disservice if we only surrounded ourselves with the people of the similar view. And so similar to Prof. Walid, what we did was that I think what we found was that our cast maybe had a particular political leaning. We introduced voices and permanent hosts that actually differed from some of our political leanings or maybe opinions. And that made us realize that we may not necessarily be neutral as individuals, but as a show, we then became somewhat balanced. And no matter our political leanings, if we had a guest, we always treated them fair and the same, regardless of which party they came
I
from.
like the idea of fairness, right? Can we talk a little bit more about the idea of fairness? Do we as podcasters, for example, do we see it as our responsibility to call out where we feel fairness is abrogated? Do we, or do we remain neutral? Now, I'm pushing the envelope a little bit here intentionally, because you can be a podcaster maintaining neutrality where you're merely essentially a platform for people to air their views, or do you come in with an editorial position and engage?
Perhaps if I may add.
Yes.
Yes, I think neutrality that comes at the expense of harming the safety of your shared space is something to be avoided. And why I say that is because at the end of the day, even as a facilitator, when you are holding a conversation, when you are creating that space for individuals to share their perspectives, you also want to make sure that everyone follows a shared set of norms and principles to humbly and fairly disagree or share their perspectives. And I think that also then should be magnified or is magnified subconsciously through the podcasts.
Is what you're going to say more important than how you say it? You see, you can have conviction, but you don't have to be rude about it. You don't have to browbeat. But at the same time, I think it is important for us to also play a role in socializing the ground to be less thin-skinned. There is also a responsibility there. The problem is, if we treat every issue with kids' gloves, we are not contributing to the maturing of society. At some point, people have to know how it feels to fall and hurt yourself, and then how to dust your knees and get up and move on. So it's a balance again. How much of kids' gloves do you use? Do you pamper? Do you mollycoddle? Or do you start opening up so that people are more frank? That's also a way of creating a new safe space, a new normal. Otherwise, we are going to be in the same spot, being extremely polite about everything around us. I don't think that's what you mean. But that could be what is prescribed. And I don't think that is necessarily progress. You've been dying to say something, both of you.
Please.
I have a very, personal experience with fairness and balance and neutrality, because there's a very interesting focus on Malay voters this time around. In my knowledge, I've been voting only twice, but this is the first time I'm seeing that there's such a focus on Malay voters, and it's because Masagos and Faisal were contesting together in Tampines. So I was actually invited a lot to provide that Malay Muslim perspective, but I think I did not want to overgeneralize. Like, I know we're a small community, but I don't represent everyone's views. And in terms of, I do think how you say things is more important than what you're saying. So I when I was trying to, offer some learnings, right? Because the rest of the community, the non-Malay Muslims, are watching and saying like, oh, so how is the Malay Muslim community going to react to this, and how the rest of Singaporeans supposed to react to this? So I think I was able to do that by zooming out on a more macro level instead of going personal.
Can you explain that?
Yeah, so basically what my take was that it's important for us not to look at these candidates along racial lines. Like, yes, they are Malay Muslim candidates, but does not necessarily mean that they only represent Malay Muslim voters. And I think it's very important to acknowledge that, because we are a very diverse community. But separately, I think also the question of the role of the Minister of Muslim Affairs came up, but also all Malay Muslim candidates, political office holders, are they meant to be the sole representatives of Malay Muslim views? That has been the case, but I think there's a lot of frustration in the community because they feel like their views are not represented. So I offered to open that and offer that maybe non-Malay Muslim politicians can also represent the Malay Muslim community, just like any politician can talk about migrant worker rights,
right.
Or women's issues. So it does not have to be limited to Malay Muslim politicians talking about Malay Muslim issues.
Walter, I saw you nodding. Not nodding off, but nodding. But we have talked about this before, this point about non-Malay Muslim, as an example, speaking up on issues on an issue of conviction.
I mean, maybe this is a bit separate from the whole podcast story or angle and so on, but I think it has to do actually with the nature of representation in Singapore, especially if you're representing anything other than, I would say, a very majoritarian kind of view, right? And I think this is actually a problem that the Singapore system has always struggled with, because Singapore is multicultural, multiracial, multi-religious society. And yet, despite all of that, I'm not sure we have done a terribly good job, actually, especially I think for the majority, right, of actually having the majority appreciate what life in Singapore is actually like for non-majority Singaporeans. I think that's an issue. And I think in particular, coming back to this whole, prominent for Malay Muslim issues in this particular election, something which is, I think, very hard for the majority to appreciate is that by default, an issue which affects the Chinese community in Singapore, the Chinese middle class community especially, is automatically a national issue. Everybody will be happy to talk about it. But then when it is an issue that affects perhaps more minority, then actually the majority will say, wait, this is actually a very narrow issue. Shouldn't we be talking about, national issues? And it's hard for the majority to appreciate that by default everything is national issue for them, but it's not so for other groups, right? So I think maybe what is lost actually in this particular GE, I feel, was that there was a learning opportunity that I think, I guess, everybody could have looked at it more. A learning opportunity actually for the majority to appreciate that what a lot of minorities want in terms of their issues being articulated in national space is just to have it taken with the same seriousness as issues which mattered in the majority, and people don't get that. I think that was unfortunately quite sad, I think. Yeah.
Right. Yes.
Actually, as I hear this conversation, originally I had nothing to add, but I just kind of thought of something. Like you think about the role that we play as podcasters, right? The choices that we make in editing matters a lot, because for example, if someone says something, how much laughter is at the end, do you choose to show or not show, would prime your audience in a certain way, right? So one of the things I keep thinking about is that if a topic is important, like what Walter mentioned, an issue that normally the majority Chinese may not be so concerned about, they think it's a fringe issue, right? Is there a need for affirmative action almost as a podcaster to give that particular topic more attention because it warrants that attention?
If Walid was to bring up the issue of Gaza or Palestine, it'll straight away be seen as he's partisan. But if a non-Malay/Muslim was to bring that up, somehow, especially if it's the Chinese who brings it up, it'll probably be a lot more palatable. There is, I think, a serious disdain, concern, even fear of partisan views. So, number one, I feel that we need to acknowledge this. It's not unnatural, but it's not good. But we need to start addressing this because there are people beyond the stereotypes who also share the same perceptions, same viewpoints. I share some of the views of my Malay or Muslim friends. I share the views on other occasions with my Chinese friends. But I think we need to open up our minds a little bit more and stop pigeonholing people. And I feel that podcasters like us are well positioned to socialize society in incremental ways. But I feel it's important, and I'd like to hear from the rest of you. Yes, Darren.
No, okay, so I just wanted to respond to the whole affirmative action point that you raised just now, because when you said that, I was thinking, what does that actually mean? Does that mean, for example, that a podcast should cover a particular kind of issue, even if, for example, the audience typically doesn't really, want to listen to it, and I don't think that's a good idea, because ultimately, we are podcasters, we are content creators, we are private. We are not government controlled. We are not a public good in that sense of the word. You don't get a mandate in that sense, So we are beholden to some level to our audience, right? And in a way, it's about providing that safe space as well for your audience. So this kind of ties a little bit to what you were asking just now about, is there need to call out if you have particular outfits that are not fair? And I think it's actually okay for certain outfits to either explicitly or not so explicitly hold a particular view, endorse a particular view, because we are a diverse society. I mean, we always say this, right? But what does that actually mean? That means that at the end of the day, no matter what you do, there are gonna be 101 different views among us, and we're gonna have to live together, and they're all gonna need their own space as well as a common space to where ideas are shared and whatever. And does the podcast format or content, does it necessarily have to be that common space? Can it also be that safe space where it's a platform for maybe your own community's issues to be ventilated?
It can be both, right?
Exactly. So to mandate, for example, I mean the affirmative action kind of concept, like if you are maybe let's say our platform, right? A little bit more skewed. Our audience at the very least, numerically, big number of it
Malay
Muslim.
Muslim.
Malay Muslim. Does that mean that I necessarily have to, for example, feature Chinese?
To balance it.
Yeah, I don't really understand how that works. I mean, if you're talking about CNA, of course national one, right? You should be covering national stuff, which includes all of the communities.
So let's hear a response from Walid.
No, I agree with him. Just to respond to the earlier point, part of the confusion or sometimes sensitivities when we discuss these minority issues, part of it is also the way the institutions are designed. So on one hand, the GRC mandates that the minority representative is supposed to represent the minority. On the other hand, not too much. Otherwise, it becomes a Malay issue and Indian issue, right? So the minority MP is always in a bind. How much do I want to be? So this is where I think, where we talk about allyship, I think having allyship among podcasters also help, right? If we could have like the Malay Muslim issues, the sensitive ones, or minority issues, if the other podcasters could also discuss it. Not that it's an obligation, it's not an obligation, as Darren said. It's just that it's a good to address basis, because I agree. The last thing we want is more regulation for this kind of space. The safe spaces.
I thought you welcomed
these are the spaces we were already free from government intervention. We don't want more of that, right? It's just that if we are thinking about a code of conduct, right? How we could help assist each other. And it doesn't mean, it could be that someone is extremely pro-Israel as well, right? Another podcaster, but maybe have a discussion on their podcast. And I think that's fine. And likewise for me as well, or on hijab, whatever the issue is. But just getting others who, just now Yuli said, unfortunately it's true what she said, how the person says matters. It shouldn't, but it matters more than
does.
And who says it matters as well, unfortunately.
Just to kind of hearing what you're talking about so far, I agree with Darren that really we're not beholden to any particular community, and really the idea of us being a safe space for our community. And at the same time, I think the interesting thing is that, the phrase, right?
Sorry, safe space for our community
for
or
people,
society?
For our community, for people who listen to us.
Okay.
Yeah, for those that kind of are following. But at the same time, the phrase, right, with great power comes great responsibility. The fact is that we all have a following, and I mean, if you have maybe 10 followers, it's okay if we say what we want and no one will really care. But the fact is that, we have tens, even hundreds of thousands of followers. And I guess when the question is, given that, yes, we have our primary communities that we are maybe the most accountable to, but the fact is that do we have a responsibility as well to kind of be the safeguarding of that space, the public space in general? And like what Prof. Walid said, right? Maybe we can have our own views on things, but maybe as the role models of our followers who actually see us as neutral and balanced, can we kind of role model what it means to encourage more conversations, even with different viewpoints?
I'd like to hear from all of you, the non-podcasters as well, right? I'd like to hear from you, what is the one thing that you would like to see podcasters do between now and the next 5 years? What is it you'd like podcasters to be seen doing more of, and yourself? And secondly, what is it that you feel strongly we should not do, we should not engage in, we should not do? Okay, this is for us to move towards coming up with something we can collectively sign off on, a code of conduct, so to speak. Is there something, right? Who'd like to go first? Yes, Walid. Two mics. You can all do it.
So one thing to do, one thing not to do. So I think one thing all of us should do is we should continue the politicizing process. I think Singaporeans have been politicized more because of podcasts, the podcast scene. I think we should continue that, and that means being the balanced voice, not neutral. I do not like the term neutral, but balanced voice in terms of offering perspectives to different people. And that means giving exposure to the opposition candidates, just as we did during the elections, but also not exclusively opposition, right? Getting government people on as well. So that is one thing I hope we will continue to do over the next 5 years. Not wait until the writ of election is issued, but we'll do it now. The one thing that I hope we'll do less of, I know probably this is a losing battle, is, I think we don't need, questions. When we have politicians on, we don't need, what is one thing that keeps you up at night? We don't need those kinds of softball questions, or fewer of those softball questions.
Or that I grew up in a rented flat.
If I may strongly disagree, and just because I think
How dare you?
he was probably referring to us when he said that. I think it goes back to your question about progress and what that looks like, and what does the maturation of the discourse look like. And I think it really depends on the starting point, because while we can look at podcasts as a whole as a monolith, actually we cater to very different audiences, differing levels of interest in politics. I think for us, we're very intentionally middle ground. Middle brow. And so we are not trying to be more intellectual than we are. We are by no means experts. We're at best armchair critics. But also we try not to be too trashy. As some might disagree. So I think for us, the progress to us looks like trying to convert someone who may be apathetic towards politics to bring them into the fray. And that could be maybe finding out what they're like personally as a person. And to me, that's a stronger starting point rather than not being democratically participative at all. And then I think the other podcasts that are probably more analytical than we are, or a lot more smarter than we are, get to then cater to the higher brow folks. So I think it really depends on what the starting point is.
And the thing you don't want to see?
I think something that we realized ourselves and we caught ourselves doing was not distinguishing between opinion and fact. And I think it's very easy for us as podcasts because we talk for a living and we can talk for ages and ages. And because of our lived experience or maybe working experience, we may share an opinion and not position it as such. And it can easily skew the opinion of the audience if we don't make sure that, or we don't make it known that actually this is an opinion rather than a fact. And I think that's something that we've been mindful of and hopefully more mindful of too.
Sorry, just a mea culpa to Daily Ketchup. So,
hey, don't use such big words. Can you explain?
Peace offering. So, when after my appearance on the Daily Ketchup, I have been stopped on the streets, like by people, like just randomly. Hey, you appeared on Daily Ketchup. That has never happened before with my podcast, like my 100+ episodes. So he is right. They have a wider, and I also find from the comment section of the Daily Ketchup, which I have been monitoring a lot now, ever since my appearance, it's quite an open-minded audience, more so than a lot of other podcasts.
Wonderful.
Ever since you come on, we've had many people say, I'm so glad you had Walid on. He's our favorite guest.
Okay. Can both of you get a room? Okay, let me go to this side. Poor guys, Okay, who wants to go first?
Actually, I agree with the point that you need something more frivolous also, because if you don't have that, right, some audience just wouldn't tune in.
Yeah.
And if nobody's listening to you, then no one cares about what you do, right? So what I'd like to see more in podcasting is more aggregation of information. Because all of us are good at certain things. For example, Daily Ketchup, you're good at engaging the Gen Zs, getting the interviews from people in high places, right? Those people I cannot get, for example. Then you got Walid, who's able to get all sorts of people from the Joe Teos of the world, right? That I cannot get. But all the information that you get from talking to these people, I aggregate them and I try to make sense of them to provide that independent, almost like a review, right? And I think that process of talking through what are the facts available, then forming my own opinion, that gives people one view. But I think most people are now smart enough that they're able to see that, okay, this is the build-up of facts that you put together. How does that work for me? How did I interpret the information that you just told me? And they can make sense of it themselves. So I think there needs to be a bit more of that in the podcasting space. And then what I don't want to see in podcasting is that as Singaporeans continue to engage with podcasters for their political needs, right, so to speak, as we get bigger and become more influential, so to speak, there's going to be outside factors, maybe let's say money, for example, coming to us. And then how do we then continue to stay independent in face of wealth, for example, right? I think that's a problem that we'll face probably in the future. And it's something
Transfer some of the money to us.
no, I wish I was at the stage, but I think it is something that will happen, right, at some point as we all get a bit bigger, right? So it's something to just be aware of as we continue to grow together.
Thank you.
I think for me, what I want to see more of is diversity of views and opening up of views. So say it's your podcast could be focused on a topic or a niche, but give a chance for something a little bit different to come in. And I have an example of being invited to the Financial Coconut, and the host had to reiterate, this is different from our usual, but I'm having a minority focus special because it's for GE. We think it's important, and I think that's important because for me, when I came in, right, I can offer the perspective of minority issues are not just racial issues; it can be economic issues. And the example I gave was when Muslim women are being denied job opportunities because they can't wear the tudung. It's an economic issue. They can't get better opportunities. So I think give room for that. And I think as a result of that, the normalization of diversity and differences, I think we can see less of I think such a big focus on identity and labeling, like, this is a woman's podcast, and maybe if a woman's episode, right, and you're not a woman niche podcast, and then your audience might tune out because I'm not interested in women's issues, but because you've kind of diversified, if you kind of normalize that it's important for diverse views to be present, then the audience would take it as, this is just another episode on the podcast.
Normalization.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I guess I don't want to be a bit of a Debbie Downer here, but I one thing I was struck by listening to everybody here is just how earnestly and seriously everybody here takes their responsibility as basically a podcast host or platform or a person who basically connects voters and Singaporeans to the views and issues, and you take that responsibility seriously. But there is no inherent process, I think, in the whole industry of podcasting, nor is there any inherent process in how the industry is monetized that would ensure that people actually want to have this responsibility, right? I think that's the issue. And I think especially when you look at other markets, like the United States, for example, where you might say that actually the industry is often skewed towards podcast hosts and so on, representing very extreme, very biased views, precisely because that makes more money than taking a more balanced viewpoint. That's, I think, the concern I have here. So there's nothing inherent in the ecosystem that drives you to actually be responsible and provide that balance, even though all of you actually take that very seriously. And so then coming to what should be done about all of this, the honest answer, I don't know, right? Because like Walid, I share a great distaste and concern about regulation because I think that is not a great idea. But at the same time, if the way that the ecosystem and particularly the way that the market monetizes this will push it in a certain direction, that's where you may have to ask questions like, should there be some kinds of minimum standards or something like that? For example, it might be okay to take money, right? It might be perfectly okay to take money to, for example, feature a certain personality, but then perhaps an episode which has taken money for that ought to be obliged to actually say that it's taken money to do that, So things like that. So I'm not saying that there should be censoring or anything, but perhaps there should be some minimum transparency in certain issues. That's all.
Thank you.
Yeah, for me, I think the thing I want to see more of is people staying true to their taste. I think it's very difficult to tell people what you should do, but it's easy to be more self-aware of like what you think you're interested in, what you think you care about, and follow that. And I think that as you build a public platform, it might be tempting to just take the safe course. I think the bigger you get, it might be more tempting to do that because you worry about alienating your audience. So actually, the more I would like to see is more of my peers trusting themselves more. I think that would be great. And then the thing that I hope not to see is basically that we all create mini echo chambers for ourselves. I think that's my greatest worry. Because if Singapore were only 5 million, right, if everyone is a small echo chamber, then we don't hear each other. And I think that's what worry me and keep me up at night. There you go.
He's either very funny or I hope you're just funny. Who hasn't spoken here? 1, 2, Okay, Darren.
Okay. In terms of what I want to see, so I'm actually going to echo what Walid said just now, which is, and I like the term because you said the politicization, right, of our audiences in that sense, because you're encouraging people to think a little bit more about politics. But what I would kind of caveat there a little bit is that it's not necessarily partisanization, because G's done, 9 days done. We have like a new government for the next 5 years, whatever. Content goes on for the next 4 or 5 years. But I think people should be thinking about what it means for our country now. Like not in terms of for their party or for a particular party. No, it's about this country that we call home, this island that we call home. What should we be thinking about in terms of its governance, its future? We've got very pressing issues, like you said just now, financial problems. A lot of people face that. Demographics, diversity issues, tied very closely to the demographics, migration or whatever. Like these are things that I think we can, not that we should, because like I said, right, like we have our own audiences to cater to. But I think it's good if we can put this in to continue this politicization process, because I think it's part and parcel of us as a society maturing after 60 years of independence. What I would hope not to see is, I'm going to echo you, like this echo chamber effect. Even, and I know that it sounds a little bit like almost dissonant with what I said earlier, but I don't think they actually contradict each other, which is you can have safe spaces because you have your audience to cater to. But just make sure that we don't become societies in some other parts of the world where polarization has just become so entrenched that you can't even have a conversation with somebody else. I mean, I love the fact that, like Walid said just now, and I mean, we all know here how strongly he feels about the Palestinian issue, but and when we have had our own conversations offline before, but that he can engage with somebody who thinks basically on the polar opposite end of him. Because I don't necessarily think it's about getting consensus. We don't need consensus per se in Singapore. We're diverse. You're never going to get one consensus. The question is, can we talk and have that conversation, even if at the end of the day, you all shake hands and shake heads and say, I still don't agree, but okay.
Thank you, Darren.
I think for me, one of the greatest things that I would really love for our podcast to continue doing is to be able to ensure that even as podcasts act as a sort of civic classroom, bringing in different perspectives, we must be able to continue creating and helping to ensure that meaning is created for our diverse narrative, our diverse audiences. And I think one other point that I really wanted to also echo was the fact that at the end of the day, our youths themselves should also come out of a podcast, or at the end of a podcast, come back asking better questions. And any podcast that gets you to think is good, but any podcast that gets you to act in a much more nuanced, in a much more informed way, and that gives you a 1 degree shift in perspective, is precisely the kind of podcast that we should aim to kind of create in the process. Probably an idea for me when I create my own podcast. And I think one thing to really avoid at all costs would really be to ensure that integrity is not lost in the process. Let us also ensure that we don't fall prey to the kind of audience that we would love to cultivate. But more importantly, we also don't lose sight of each other in the kind of perspectives and the kind of views that we want to co-create and co-nurture. Because what we really want to be able to do is hold space for those conversations and perspectives, but we also want to ensure that we don't fall prey to misinformation and disinformation.
Joe?
All right, so in the interest of time, I guess I'll just talk about what I'm hoping to see more. And I think it draws back to, I think, Dan's point on like opinion and fact. And I realized that a lot of the times as podcasters, we don't have the machinery of like mainstream media, right? Whereby, you have full-timers and teams working on specific things like research or post-production or shoots. And a lot of us are the editors, the researchers, the writers, the hosts, and everything like that. And a lot of us are tied by deadlines as well. And sometimes that means that, whether it's maybe not being as prepared as you can be for an interview, and someone says something that you can't necessarily fact check on the spot, and therefore you have to then do that fact checking in post production, or even after uploading you realize, hey, actually maybe that's not quite right. So what I'm hoping to see more maybe is just all of us maybe setting a standard whereby we can all say, maybe if we want to fact check certain things or clarify certain things, that becomes more normalized, because I think a lot of us do maybe take the only accountability part as maybe comments calling you out or POFMA, and I don't think that should be it. It really should be, your own maybe standards of content curation as well. And I think as a whole, we could do more maybe in terms of how that can look like for the audience as well. Because at the end of the day, a lot of the audience that listens to our shows, like, they tend to say, I don't like to watch mainstream media, I like to watch your shows. Which also means, even though I disagree with that, we are also, for a lot of people, their only source of information when it comes to politics or something like social issues or current affairs, right? Which also means that, if let's say something is not quite right, that's all they have. And I think that we do have the responsibility to our audience to, make sure that they have that ability to have access to correct information. Yeah.
Thank you, Joe.
I think just one more thing that I'll add, and maybe it's not for the code of conduct, but maybe something that we can all work towards, is that I don't want to assume that we'll all still be relevant 5 years from now. And I don't want to take that for granted. Because we've seen how social media can change so quickly. The way how TikTok was used 5 years from now was very different to this GE. So I think it's quite important for us to all work hard to remain relevant in our own ways, whatever our own flavors are, so that in 5 years' time, hopefully we'll still be relevant and important in some way. Yeah.
Thank you, Daniel. Yeah.
Right. So, having heard so much, I think what I want to see a lot more is really the idea of a collective, right? I think where we have our own specialization, we are diverse, and we continue to grow. Because if I look at it using the GE as a lens to kind of look at all these things, what builds trust between the politicians and the voters is not just one factor, right? There is the competency, the consistency, the ability to empathize, the conviction. And I see each of the interviews that we do, the different podcasts, bring out one element or the other. So I think that really helps to build the collective public trust in the system and in the people who are running the system. So I think that's one thing I want to see a lot more of. I think what I don't want to see is, I think as mentioned by Darren and by Keith, going down the path of echo chambers. And I think if you look at the Western societies, great, they are great for views, they're great for entertainment, but do they contribute to the growth of society as a maturing democracy? I don't think so.
I think it was William Blake, the poet, who said, to generalize is to be an idiot. It's actually very true. We are all so adept at generalizing, putting people in pigeonholes, putting podcasts in pigeonholes. But actually, for us to evolve, we must be prepared from time to time to shed our skin, to move ahead. So as Daniel, as you said, we don't know what it's going to be 1 year down, not 5. So we need to be able to adapt. Adapt, but not change at the core who we are. And integrity is important. But for me, integrity is about doing the right thing even when no one is watching. In other words, cut the wayang. Be ourselves. Strive to be a little bit of the social conscience of society without being arrogant about it. I think a certain amount of responsibility in doing it because we believe it's the right thing to do. And that's where I'd like to end this discussion perhaps with this thought about the distinction between being a patriot and a loyalist. We tend to use the terms interchangeably, but actually there's a fundamental difference. A loyalist is someone who's just loyal because he has to be loyal, because he wants to be loyal to someone. But a patriot can actually fight the system because he loves the country. A patriot doesn't hesitate to call out something because it's wrong. We often call it conviction. But I think we need to be guided by our patriotism. for this country that we love. And we need the courage to be able to stand up for what we believe in. And that same courage must be deployed in listening with more than casual interest what someone else has to say, because he is speaking his truth, just as your truth is important to you. And my wish for all of us is for us to be each other's friend. And I mean that with absolute sincerity, to grow together, to be there, to exchange views, and to be a collective conscience. And thank you very much, lady and gentlemen, for making time to be here. Thank you.